Okay, so I think we'll get started, and I just want to start by saying we're going to record the first part of this, and when we kind of move to a more audience participatory framework, we'll invite Nick to turn off the recording so that people feel comfortable saying whatever they need to say and also respecting privacy. But we're also documenting the effort that we're making in this last year of the center. So I want to make sure that we also record Kamyar's contribution.
Are you off? Sorry.
Somebody has their, make sure you're muted, please. Okay, welcome everybody. My name is Persis Karim, Center for Iranian Diaspora Studies. That's my vacuum cleaner behind me. I meant to take it out of the frame, but I welcome you to today's conversation, which is a Commun-i-Tea. Normally we do these as a kind of free-form conversation, but Kamyar reached out to me with an idea, and I thought it was such an appropriate thing for us to be doing, which is to engage in a conversation about mental health, healing, and the ways in which we struggle across generations in our diaspora to have a vocabulary for talking about mental health. So I want to first start by introducing Kamyar Jarazadeh, who lives, I think, currently in the Los Angeles area. And I'm going to read his bio because it's extensive, and I want to make sure that I honor all of his many hats that he has worn and contributes to the many things that he does. Kamyar Jarazadeh is a California registered associate clinical social worker and psychotherapist specializing in working with individuals experiencing mental health challenges such as depression, life changes, and family relationship conflicts, all from a trauma-informed lens. In addition to his work with clients, he hosts the Parakende podcast, which means scatteredness, a bilingual podcast highlighting mental health issues for the Iranian diaspora and providing information and resources related to seeking services. Kamyar also offers therapy in Persian. He draws on various experiences beyond the therapy context to enrich his work with clients. His years of experience outside of the mental health space provide valuable insight into life, family, career, meaning, and purpose. Before earning his master's degree in social work from California State University, Northridge, Kamyar obtained a bachelor's degree in interdisciplinary studies from the University of California, Berkeley, and a Master of Science in Migration Studies from the University of Oxford. So he's also lived outside the US as well. And before transitioning to the mental health field, he worked in diverse change-making roles, including migrant and refugee protection, international governance, and arts and literacy nonprofit initiatives. And I also want to say that he's a contributing editor, I believe, to Ajam Media Collective, where he specializes in music across genres and boundaries, and he's an accomplished oud player also. So welcome, Kamyar.
Thank you so much. That was very kind of you. The oud playing, thankfully I'm not playing today, so I don't have to confirm or deny that kind words. Thank you so much. I really appreciate the chance to be here because I see people are joining. I just want to do my two disclaimers real quick, if that's okay. So I'm an associate clinician here in California, but this isn't going to be actually a therapy session. You can contact me if you're looking for connections or referrals, but we're going to try to just keep things kind of more at the general level here. And we are recording because it is important to have a document of this fantastic work the center's doing, despite this being the final year, which we'll discuss. But when we get to the Q&A, just to keep everyone safe and comfortable, we're going to turn off the recording. So just a heads up on that. But yes, Persis, thank you so much for having me. Kind of ready to go wherever. I don't know where you think we should start.
Well, I thought maybe you could talk a little bit about how you came to be doing this work. Because for those of you who haven't seen it, we have a wonderful blog post. Nick, I think, will be putting it in the chat. And I didn't do the interview. Our visiting scholar, Arash Rahmani, did it. And it was so interesting for me to see kind of the trajectory of your own work being informed by working with refugee and migrant populations. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about your own trajectory and maybe talk a little bit specifically about trauma-informed, the kind of trauma-informed work you're doing now.
Sure, sure. So yes, and I will start from the beginning. So for any friends here or people who've seen me online, I appreciate your patience. I am an Iranian American. I grew up here in the United States. My parents came 70s, 80s, different stories, but combination of forced migration, a refugee sort of experience as well. And I always had that interest in working with similar populations. I wanted to work with Iranians globally. I wanted to work with refugees and migrants, and also just communities that are close to us, the Afghan community, other Middle Eastern communities, Swana communities. But I think I was always unsure of what to do. And not to recycle tropes, but this is a real trope. There is the Iranian sort of cultural belief in highly educated career paths, right? Doctor, lawyer, engineer. So my idea was initially like, oh, well, the legal field is the best way to help refugees, migrants, et cetera. And I got into human rights work when I was in an undergrad university, working with Afghan migrants in Turkey, did some human rights reporting. And that was where an interesting seed was sort of planted there of there's a legal element to human rights, our experience as Iranian Americans, right? Like everyone has a funny migration story or a tragic one. But what I started to see was really the human cost and toll that just felt like it was harder to find a space or a place for it, right? I mean, we talk about these stories of like immigrant resilience and excellence, right? My parents came this way, I came this way, and I achieved and all that. And even when the legal pieces, the sort of physical health pieces of survival are sorted, I was witnessing a lot of mental distress, pain, trauma that I didn't really know what to do with. And I was a very young person at this time. I was doing what I was learning as I was doing, like human rights reporting and documentation. I was personally deeply affected by what I was seeing. I mean, I was hearing people's stories, not really trained in understanding how to process that, how to hold that for them. But I did start to feel, and I had a great an anthropologist as my mentor at the time, Dr. Talwalkar at UC Berkeley, and she told me the power of witnessing. But I didn't really understand that, like from a mental health perspective. It was still like, oh, I'm learning and I'm gathering data, et cetera. So when I went and worked in international development, and I'll sort of spare the details on that, I just kept sort of running up against this piece. All these things that we experience, whether it's us, ourselves, or the generations above us, our ancestors, they have these effects on our psyche. And you see it and you feel it. It doesn't really require actually like an academic perspective when you're working in refugee context, someone who has that sort of experience, whether that's stories they heard or they lived it, whether you're actually in a refugee camp or someone's years out from that, you feel that there is something there, right? And we can label it and talk about it later. But eventually, when I sort of kind of felt like I hit the limits of that kind of work, I just couldn't help but find this curiosity and this passion for working with the way individuals and communities experience these things, right? So just kind of a roundabout way to say that the human element of just how is our day-to-day lives affected by our identities, conflict, migration, it's just endlessly, I think, a source of curiosity for me. Because I don't know if our community as Iranian Americans per se, as Swana people per se, I don't think we've exhausted everything we can do on this conversation. So I'll just sort of leave it there as where my interest is and why I try to do whatever I can sort of involved with the community.
Thank you. So I think one of the things that might be helpful to kind of get the conversation going with the audience is for you to lay out what you see as some of the primary issues that are preoccupying our community, either under the surface or overtly, and how they might, in fact, be part of the challenges to either identity formation or a stronger sense of connection to one another, or even in terms of building towards advocacy on a, you know, a social and political level in this country.
Sure, sure. I think to answer that, it's almost important to look at something that isn't even actually unique to Iranian Americans, but it's our reality. The fact that we're a diaspora, right? There was this big migration and then these trickling ongoing migrations that, whether you like it or not, and there's complexity, and I believe in the complexity, it's it's a cut, it's a line, it's a rupture, right? We have this divide. Whether you were born in Iran, grew up in Iran, you can access the language and culture, or you lived more outside of it. Everything we talk about mental health wise relevant to our community, individually, community level, it's all downstream of that. Just sort of basic things that when you're looking in kind of like context that doesn't exist. Let's say we're worried about a young person's mental health. Okay, let's talk about this young person. Let's talk to the family. Let's see what our ways are to sort of treat this here. When you're in this Iranian American context, now we have language difference, different perceptions layered on top of just individuals. We all have our own opinions, but now we have this generational divide, a cultural divide. There's all these questions of where do we sort of come into this family unit or this individual's life and actually do something? My concern, the reason that that's really important to me, because it could just be like, okay, well, you know, there's lots of immigrant communities, no big deal. If I'm being really specific about what worries me, I don't feel across all generations, this is just my perception, that Iranians take mental health seriously. That's kind of a blanket statement, and people will say, no, you know, we have Dr. Holakouian, and I agree with this. My concern is, I'll be very specific with it. It's in the sense that we have this perception that has historical roots that I still playing out of mental health services are for when things get really bad, right? Substance use, addiction, suicide. These are situations where it's suddenly like, let's talk to someone. But we don't really have the ability to have this other sort of approach that we're learning more and more is important, which is mental health is part of your health. You know, when we talk about health in general, like, okay, there's the body, right? But the mind is part of it. And I know this sounds really simple, but the reality is easier said than done, right? Because we have this history in Iran that plays out when you talk to people. So for the many Persian speakers in here, what's the word people use for like mental health professionals? Ravon shinos, ravon kov, psychologist, ravon pezeshk, things like that. It's very common to bring this up in the Iranian community, and people say, you know, oh, would you like to speak to a therapist? Would you like to speak to a ravon shinas, etc.? The common response, maybe you've heard this, ravani nistam ke. I'm not crazy. The word for crazy being attached to this word for psychology is also not helpful, right? This fear, this very strong fear that sort of appears. That is difficult enough to deal with in kind of cultures and communities where there's continuity, right? There's so much work we can do there. But now we sort of have to have multiple conversations, right? Because that fear means one thing to the generation that has more ties to the US. It has a different meaning to people sort of living in Iran or grew up in Iran. So there's just this level of complexity here. And then if you add in anything else, when we're talking about our community is a community that has experienced a lot of different potential traumas or just significant changes, even if you don't want to use the T word, migration, war, we have to watch what's happening politically in Iran constantly. There's so much here, and we're not starting from the strongest position because there's just this basic community element that's really not where it needs to be. So we can go into that as well. But if everyone just sort of checks out after this, I'm just going to say one thing because we're still early, everyone has energy. Seek services if you feel you need them. It doesn't have to be at the last minute. It doesn't have to be at the crisis moment, right? Openness to services. I think that's where I'm going to hopefully be my little takeaway for everyone. But so I went a little bit all over with the answer to that. But just to kind of rephrase, mental health is challenging globally, United States right now. With Iranian Americans, we kind of have additional things that we need to sort out. And I'm happy to talk about the community level of that maybe next.
Okay, thank you. Since you brought up the T word, I'll use it directly. One of the things that I see and many of us witness is that people have unhealed trauma from earlier generations. And what we know now about trauma is that sometimes it gets passed on to the next generation, even if they didn't directly experience the event or trauma itself. So what are some of the ways that you're witnessing this intergenerational trauma, and what are some of the strategies or ways you talk about it with people? And you can reveal whatever you want, because I know sometimes you're conscious of not being too direct about your clients and what they reveal to you. But I think there's so many trends, right? One, for example, is that people who experienced surveillance and state intervention are so conscious of not wanting to reveal things in this context because they think of like the state's watching you, and maybe the state will be watching us even more in the future in this country. But that's a historic thing from Iran, that, and it's even kind of part of how people think about therapy, that therapy is like people knowing your business, right? It's a kind of intervention in the private affairs of one's life. And so that's one example that I think we carried with us as a immigrant community. But there are probably many more that you see that are more immediately affecting younger people too.
Yeah, and I'll come back to that note about experiences of the state and mental health. But there's something interesting that I do like to talk about. But in terms of the pressing ones I see, I do want to share two. I think one can feel a bit sort of universal, but I think it does apply to us, of just when in a generation, someone is experiencing distress because of a certain trauma. And trauma, when we talk about it, like in the mental health context, we're looking for something specific. There was an event, there was an experience, and it left a lasting effect on that individual. So if we look at the generations that perhaps were in Iran and migrated in the last few decades, I mean, you pick, right? The experiences during the revolution, the Iran-Iraq war, just living, under the state pressure in Iran. For that individual, there's like something specific that happened, right? That they're feeling, and every day they're reliving, it's affecting their quality of life. And ideally, right, we know there's ways to at least try to address that and work through that. But what happens in our community where there is the stigma of mental health? It's not addressed, right? We have these, I can give these hypothetical examples of, so-and-so, she gets so upset from loud noises, but it's okay. 4th of July is scary. She remembers the war, but, or so-and-so, Vasvos, right? Our way of saying OCD. But, she just started doing that in Iran, and that's just how it is, etc. Okay, when we talk about the intergenerational element, I'm being very specific here. Someone growing up in that context, that causes distress for them. They have to see their parent, their aunt, their grandparent sort of suffering through something that they don't understand why, they don't understand what's going on, and then that's going to cause distress for them. So I think with intergenerational trauma, sometimes we get very abstract, right? Like, and you can, and there is an argument for things that like happened hundreds of years ago that trickled down, et cetera. And that's a different conversation. But the one that's in front of me is when families, communities very specifically have gone through things that affects their ability to just live and be, people around them are also suffering. So a lot of the work that we have to do in therapy then is, okay, for the person in front of me, how do we process your experience of your family, where people maybe experience state violence, torture, difficult migration experience? Okay, well, we have to work with you for that because that had an effect on you. But what would be the dream? What would be the ideal? I want that person in front of me. I want mom, dad, grandpa to come in through whatever form, even if it's not therapy, find their healing. But that's one concern that I have, is that, again, the rupture point I mentioned, even if it's language or culture, it's hard for families and communities to have that conversation themselves. So then instead, we're kind of working backwards with whoever's just able to realize, oh, I need support processing something here. But, you know, we're sort of one arm tied behind our back, right? The other piece I want to talk about, that I'll explain, is this identity formation piece. So the concept I'll introduce here, it's very social work friendly, which is why I love it. There's a lot of research, especially with like indigenous communities, that have a basic idea that when you participate in your culture, you get a lot of benefits. Your mental health improves, your physical health can improve, you feel better about yourself, you make stronger social connections. Culture is not sort of just like a cherry on top of life, was what we're seeing from some of this research, right? It can actually be part of our wellness. And I think we're in a community where I will speak with some experiences that I've had. There's this idea of, what's the point? The kids, they're born in America, they're Americans, they don't speak Farsi, they forgot Farsi. It's not even that useful of a language. Iran's, you know, it's Iran, it's not going great. This sense of, they'll be fine. Okay, sure. I mean, you know, it's not like air where you won't breathe without it, but we're missing out on something that can be a real source of healing, growth, connection. And when it's missing, you do have crises of identity. And it's sort of happening, interestingly, I find now, when the generation born after that initial migration is now getting older, and they're making their own families. And we know, Neda Mahmoula is here from her fantastic work. We know the sociological trends of what Iranian Americans are looking like, right? We're mixed. We don't have as much sort of like language preservation, things like that, et cetera, which is okay. I mean, sort of how things go in the States. But we have these questions that people have to actually bring to therapy as well. What's my family going to look like? I mean, it's a fantastic question, right? What am I going to pass down? How are my children, if I have children, or my community going to connect with me and my heritage? There's a way to sort of give people more resources in advance to deal with this, right? We know it is more ideal for people to at least have access to their community, to like learn their language, use their language, find a space to sort of express their Iranianness and find whatever that means for them. But when we don't have that, we're just sort of setting ourselves up for a crisis down the line, right? And that, again, intergenerationally, right? There's going to be even questions for this next generation I see coming up, of the many sort of mixed families, their kids growing up of half, quarter Iranian heritage, et cetera. We know, what are they going to tap into and find? And that's why I find myself so drawn to the work of the center, already sort of lamenting, you know, the future here, because these sort of spaces, for me as a mental health clinician, there's actually a wellness component to it. There is actually something healing and preserving about being able to explore identity. And we know this from research from other communities. So it's a separate question of community work, but just to sort of speak to those two sort of intergenerational pieces, the loss of identity, it does eventually show up sometimes in our mental health. And those unresolved memories, traumas, definitely have ripple effects, and they show up. So those are my big two.
Thank you. And then I'll ask one more question to maybe think through this idea of trauma, because in addition to some of those traumas that people inherited or brought with them from Iran, we now have another generation that's growing up. I wish I could say post-Trump, but I can't now. You know, they're the earlier traumas of the hostage crisis, 9/11, the Muslim ban, and now we're facing potentially another level of hostility, discrimination, I don't know what to call it because we know it might entail all of those things, and including possibly outright legal discrimination, right, which the Muslim ban is suggestive of. So there are also ways in which younger people, in response to some of those earlier episodes, have either retreated or become more overtly connected to their Iranian culture, Iranianness, as a way of resisting. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about some of those elements of historical episodes or periods in the US context that you have seen or you think are incredibly important.
Sure, sure. So again, I'm going to humbly speak on this because we have Dr. Nana Marbula here, and she's just inspired so many of my thoughts on this. But from the sort of mental health perspective, I always sort of think of kind of like, what are the repeating patterns? Something we're very interested in therapy, right? What are patterns? How do we change them, et cetera? I spend a lot of time reflecting on actually the hostage crisis, because when you talk to Iranian kind of elders or people who experienced that in the US, so that was my parents' generation was here for that. There was kind of these two choices that keep appearing in front of us as a community. Do we retreat? Do we look for safety? We hide our identities, we change our name, we change our jobs. Or does this inspire rebellion? We embrace our identities to sort of fight against what we see happening. We accept the risks of being visibly not wanted, right? Whether that's violence or legal violence, things like that. It kind of produces two types of community members every time. And again, 9/11. Do we retreat? Again, how many people sort of have these stories from their families, changing names, shortening the last name, things like that, or embrace? I mean, there's a whole generation now of Iranian American artists, writers, etc., poets. That's their origin story, right? I didn't feel very Iranian until this happened, right? The racializing experiences, as they say, and I embraced it. The issue with sort of these two is that I do worry that they actually both there's not one that's right and one that's wrong. They both actually create sort of concerns when it comes to sort of mental health and kind of trying to actualize our identities, because, well, when we retreat, we reduce maybe our distress in the moment, right? People aren't calling out my race. They can't say bad things about me, discriminate against me. I'm a little safer there. But then there's these internal identity issues, right? Of, okay, but who am I? What am I? What will the next generation learn from me if I've suppressed my culture? On the other side, with this embrace, it's, kind of, I think, because we're all sort of, I mean, we're all here, maybe we're more into that, right? We're at the Center for Iranian Diaspora Studies, right? But there's also this sort of issue of when you have an oppositional identity, it actually makes it a little bit harder to sort of fully engage, especially without kind of politics in the mix. So, there are these really great solidarity movements we have, being Swana and, Iranians identifying as people of color. But it's almost like sometimes politics can suck up the air for the other stuff that's kind of more basic of just, okay, Iranian in the sense of I'm not white and I don't approve of what's happening globally or in the US government. But there's just also more basic stuff of, well, what does be Iranian mean to you that's not in opposition? Is it language? Is it culture? Is it music? Is it how you relate to your family? And sometimes when we just focus so much on kind of this political piece, we miss out on these other things that are also very important, right? We talk about anything, sexuality, gender identity. There is a layer that intersects, intersectionality is so big right now, with culture. And I just sometimes worry, as much as I do see strength in like political activism and organizing based around your identity, I do sometimes worry that we're missing some of these things that don't feel as pressing, but they actually are important for identity formation of just, okay, being Iranian as a way to push back against racism, the global order, sure, but just on the individual level. You see people sort of now, there's more ways as an adult to learn Farsi, things like this. I don't think they're tangential to mental health. And I think those are also really important. So yeah, these historical moments, I just think they keep producing the same kind of split. And I would just really hope that eventually, like with more community space and engagement and what newer generation are trying to do, people can just sort of find what works for them and build something more holistic that just serves all parts of who we are. So yeah, that's what my thoughts on those repeating traumas.
Okay, because I'm eager to make a space for others, if you don't mind, we'll shift gears and we'll invite people to comment or ask questions. So we're gonna turn off the spotlight and we're gonna also turn off the recording so people feel comfortable and free to express themselves. If you want to turn on your camera, great. If you feel more comfortable having the black screen with your name, that's fine too. And if you want to put something in the chat, I'll facilitate making sure that comment gets read or a question gets read.